This is Indigenous Insights, Eagle Radio's weekly Anishinaabe radio program. Missing and murdered Indigenous women. Joining us on the air, we have Ariel Faltz, a member of the Keweenaw Indian community, and she works in Indigenous Victims Services. Ariel, welcome back.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's move right into it. Bring us into today's story.
Today we're going to go back to Canada, and we're going to cover the story of Delores Brower. And Delores was a Métis woman living in Edmonton, Alberta, which is out west. And she worked in the sex trade industry, which is kind of important to the story, but we'll come back to that part. Delores, who went by the nickname Spider, was last seen alive in the early morning hours of May 13th, 2004, almost 15 years ago.
Okay, so initially, some questions right off the bat. You said she was in the sex trade industry?
Yep.
And like legally or illegally?
Well, it's illegal, but there's certain organizations that help people who are working in the sex trade industry to like in harm reduction and stuff like that. But in the end, what she was doing is illegal, yeah.
Okay. Another initial question here, just to kind of get to know the person in the story. How old was she when she went missing?
She was 33 when she went missing.
She was 33 when she went missing. Okay, give us a little bit of a brief overview of some of those circumstances.
Well, it was reported that she was last seen trying to hitchhike west from almost right in the middle of Edmonton, which is a huge city. She was known to local police, but not for bad reasons, just from patrolling their neighborhood. And the police described her as street smart and she having a pleasant demeanor. She had told friends that she had planned to get off the streets, saying that she found a male friend that was going to take her in and give her a rent break. So while the people who knew her hoped that that's where she went and she succeeded in her plan of leaving the streets, Delores met a different fate. On April 19th, 2015, 10 years after Delores was last seen alive, her remains were discovered on a rural property near Rollyview, Alberta, which is just south of Edmonton. I think of like 30 kilometers. A property owner found the remains on their property and reported it to the police. Delores' family stated that they were saddened to confirm that Delores' remains were found, but there was a sense of thankfulness as well. They said, "We loved Delores and are grateful to have some closure."
So 10 years later,
yeah,
they found her remains. Okay, so just taking my notes here so I can prep my questions. So, well, I guess my first question would be, is what kind of evidence can they get from those remains 10 years after the fact?
I don't know if they've been able to get any evidence. The last thing that I found that was made public, I think, was in 2016, so a year after her remains were found, and there's been no updates on that case since then.
So no updates. What kind of things were they working with before they found the remains? Did they have any kind of evidence other than the fact that they knew that she was trying to hitchhike west?
No, nothing that's been stated publicly. But the RCMP, or Canada's version of the FBI, was familiar with Delores because she registered herself with something called Project CARE, K-A-R-E, which is a RCMP-led task force that was set up to investigate the deaths and disappearances of women in high-risk lifestyles. And this was developed in 2003, which is when there was a wave of violent crime occurring against women working in the sex trade industry around Edmonton. So this task force was able to keep details about women like Delores, including information about her family, her past, her dental records, and her DNA. So they did have that the whole time she was missing, but they didn't have anything to compare it to.
Well, so is that what they used then to identify the remains when they found them?
Yeah, they used her dental records that they had kept on file all the years that she was missing.
Okay, so, I mean, they weren't able to come up with a cause of death or anything like that with the remains?
Not yet, no. It hasn't been confirmed how she died, but it's definitely thought that she was murdered, and investigators have thought that for a while, even before her remains were found.
Okay. So what about suspects? I mean, official, unofficial suspects? There's anything like that in this case?
Yeah, there is a few suspects, actually. Like I mentioned that there was a wave of violent crime in Edmonton around the time she went missing, and her remains were actually found within an 8-kilometer radius or 5-mile radius from where 2 other missing women's remains were found. And she was one of the 3 sex trade workers that went missing in 2004 in Edmonton.
Wait, so how close was that again?
Within a 5-mile radius.
Within a 5-mile radius. Okay, so anything from those cases that's more known that could be connected with this case?
Well, at one point, there was a suspect name in Dolores' disappearance that stemmed from the investigation into the other murdered women. His name was Thomas Sevilla, and in 2008, he was charged with murdering two other sex workers in 2004 and 2005. He was convicted of killing one, but acquitted of the other murder. And over time, the RCMP investigators connected the deaths of those two women with several other missing women, including Dolores, and they believe that all these crimes are likely committed by the same person. I really want to make these stories about the victim, but unfortunately there's not too much that I could find about Delores, but it does address a bigger issue of missing women who work in the sex trade industry. So there are a couple of suspects that I do want to dig a little bit deeper into here. The first one that I mentioned, Thomas Sevilla, his sister actually reported him to the police because she found a body inside of a hockey bag that Sevilla had left at her home just north of Edmonton.
Wait. She found an actual body in a hockey bag from him?
Yeah, in his hockey bag, she found a body of a woman.
Okay. So that's how he was initially caught then, his sister?
Yeah, so when she reported him, then it started unfolding a bit. And he was sentenced to 17 years in prison in 2008 for second-degree murder for that particular woman's murder.
For just 17 years?
Yeah.
You can have a woman's body in a hockey bag and you can be out in 17 years. Is that typical?
I mean, not in America. I feel like in the U.S., a lot more people are sent to prison for life and they stay there until they die, or they have a lot longer of sentences. But in Canada, even a life sentence doesn't mean that you'll die in prison, which is really weird to me.
Yeah, okay. We'll just leave that alone for a second. Continue with what you're telling us.
Well, in 2010, a judge ruled that Sevilla is a dangerous, violent offender and must stay in prison indefinitely, stating, "I don't believe there's a possibility for meaningful change for Sevilla." It definitely makes sense that investigators would feel that Sevilla is responsible for Dolores' death just because of the circumstances of the other women's deaths. But there's another possible theory that another man named Joseph Labukin could be responsible for Dolores' death as well.
Okay.
He was charged with the murder of two other Edmonton sex trade workers and is serving a life sentence.
So, Ariel, there are a couple of suspects in this case. We've talked about them, and they're both in prison for other crimes at the moment.
Yeah, they are both in prison for murder of other sex workers.
Okay, and you've also mentioned that there have been other murders since then that are kind of similar to Delores.
Yeah, specifically in the Edmonton area, there's been murders and disappearances of sex workers. So it's a possibility that Dolores' murder is related to Sevilla and Labukin, but there's also a possibility that there's just another evil person or people in the Edmonton area that target sex trade workers.
All right, so are we sort of hitting that dead end, or what's some of the latest developments on the case?
From my research, there hasn't really been any developments since Dolores' remains were found, that at least nothing that's been made public. Hopefully investigators are able to find some evidence about at least what happened to her, and if that evidence leads to Sevilla or Labukin, they won't ever get out of prison on parole, and there'll be some answers. But if it leads to someone else, then another dangerous person will be locked away too. So hopefully they just keep looking into it and figuring out what happened so that it won't happen again.
And be able to get that more closure for the family.
Yeah.
Ariel, tell us a little bit about Project CARE.
Project CARE was created in 2003 as a response to several vulnerable missing persons in the Edmonton area. And that includes people living high-risk lifestyles like the case we just covered. And today it's known as the Alberta RCMP Missing Persons Unit, but it was created as a reactive approach to making sure that high-risk individuals' cases are investigated should they go missing or become murdered.
Okay, so what are your thoughts on it? It's been around for a while now. How's it doing?
Well, Project CARE in itself was a great step toward making sure people working in the sex industry who go missing aren't forgotten about and that their cases are being investigated, and I think that's great in itself. But I feel that it's a little reactive rather than proactive because they collect all of this information about high-risk individuals so that should they go missing or should they be murdered, then they can investigate it rather than focusing on preventing the violence against people living high-risk lifestyles.
Okay, I gotcha. So they're reacting to the situation instead of trying to fix it.
Right, and they might be doing stuff behind the scenes that works on that prevention piece, but on the surface, it just seems like it's police that are specifically there to investigate these high-risk missing and murdered people.
All right, so maybe that's something that we should look into a little bit, some of those preventive actions some of the people are taking out there. Is there anything you've heard of at all of, people doing more proactive stuff?
There are some things that Project CARE is doing that reduces the risk for people, such like health and safety education. They can refer them to other programs if they're struggling with addiction. They help them safety plan and things like that. But still, in its conception, it was a reactive approach, and all of these things that they offer are great too, but it's not big enough, in my opinion, to really prevent violence.
Okay, so, and I'm just curious, is there something equivalent to that program here in America that you've heard of?
I mean, from what I understand, it's kind of similar to different Indigenous or victim services programs. And there's different victim services programs all over in the U.S. and in Canada that offer similar things like safety planning and harm reduction things like clinics and things like that. So it's not a lone thing only in Edmonton. There's different versions of it all over the place.
Okay, so everybody should just look into the different programs that are out there if they're interested.
Yeah, and especially if they want help, they can always reach out to any victim services place, and I'm sure they'll be more than willing to refer them somewhere. I also wanted to touch on the fact that women who work in the sex industry are more likely to become victims of violence for various reasons, whether it's the stigma attached to what they do for a living, maybe it has to do with the police not thinking they're important enough to put resources towards, or just like the general attitude that people have towards women who work in the sex industry. I don't know, but that's still a fact that's there. And I mentioned before that Project CARE seems to be reactive rather than proactive for the most part, and what they're doing to be proactive isn't big enough. And this brings me to the controversial subject of decriminalizing sex work. It's been discussed a lot recently and all over the place. I mean, in New Zealand, they decriminalized sex work. I feel decriminalizing would be helpful in ensuring the safety of sex workers because they would be able to come forward when something feels off without worrying about getting in trouble for the work that they do. If it's decriminalized, it can be organized like a legal brothel, and they can have people looking out for them, and sex workers will be able to feel safer when going to work. My point in bringing up decriminalizing sex work is that we as a society should be moving forward with this rather than trying to make laws and policies that are more strict on people who work in the sex industry.
Indigenous Insights, Eagle Radio's weekly Native American radio program. You can find these episodes Saturdays at noon on Eagle Radio. We stream from keepitinthe.up.com, and we're also on YouTube and Twitter. My name is Mitch Bolo. I'm a member of the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. We also have Ariel with us. She works in Indigenous Victim Services. She's also a member of the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. And my sister, Ariel, thank you so much for taking the time and doing the research for us once again.
Thank you for having me.
Ariel dedicates her own time to putting together the stories for these episodes. She does work in Indigenous Victim Services, but this is a complete side gig for her. She does it out of passion and the need to contribute in any way she can. Ariel, we'll see you next week.
See ya.
This is Indigenous Insights.